Thanks. Howdy. Well, thanks for having me today. It's always good to come back here to A&M, and this is where it all started for me in grad school. So my background is, Kirk was saying, undergrad biomedical engineering, master's and PhD, both here at Texas A&M bioengineering. My research interests were in thermoablative therapies, and you'll understand how we got to Visualase after that. I've been president and CEO since the beginning of the company when there was two of us, and I still have the distinction of saying I have never created a resume for the purpose of getting a job. So hopefully that stays true. Otherwise, I've messed some things up. I was a former founder, president, chief operating officer at Visualase, which was a spin-out company, and that's the story I'll be telling you about. I'm a board member. I'm an investor in various other early-stage medtech companies today, as well as helping run a company that partners with those early companies to do the development work. This was our original founding mission, was to develop, launch, and manufacture, commercialize novel medical biotechnologies. There was four of us at the time, myself, my late partner who also did his PhD here at Texas A&M, two of our professors, one of which is still here at A&M, the other which is now at the National Science Foundation. Back then it was very hard to start a company. It was very tough for university professors to be involved with companies. Today I teach classes on how to do it, and it's actually promoted by the university, so a lot's changed in 20 years. We've changed as well, so our business today is more of a development firm. We partner with physicians, startups. We help them take their ideas to finished medical products, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. We've been doing this for 20 years now, so we have a good understanding of what it takes to take that idea through all the stages that are required. Our mission has changed a little bit. We focus more on the patients. We do that for two reasons. One, we know that if we focus on products that have a significant impact on human lives, that all the rest will come, all the financial benefits for both employees and investors. And for ourselves. We call it doing good while you do well. And we operate in a very unique space where you get to do that. We get to create products that have both great business potential, but also exceptional impact on patients. This is the management team today. Myself, my two main partners, Manish and Charles, who are both heavily experienced in med device, many years, different companies. Many of those were acquired. Andre Marquette, who is our VP of Sales and Marketing for Visualase, the spin-out, we recently hired him on board. He helps us when products are coming out of the development engine, getting ready for commercialization, and he's leading one of those efforts right now for one of our products. When we started the company, there was two of us. We had an office here in Bryan, Texas, about 200 square feet. We now have an 18,000 square foot facility in Houston. We're up to about 47 employees today. We'll be close to 55 probably by end of year. So a lot of growth going on, a lot of exciting projects that we're working on. Yeah?
Is that growth on the biomedical engineer side or on the business side?
Mostly in the engineering side. It's because of our core business is development, and so it's mostly bringing in new projects, staffing up to be able to handle those projects. Yeah, so hold the question, I'll just keep going. But yeah, in interest of time. So we focus on industrial design, mechanical engineering, software development, and electronics hardware. And if you can handle these four disciplines, you can handle a lot in the med device space. We put a high premium on industrial design. We want products that look, feel fantastic, that attract a user just by the way they look. And it's similar. Doctors are no different than any other human. Their initial interest is going to be gauged by the way they see something, the way it appeals to them, the way it looks and feels.
Sure. So do you focus more on structuring companies to be attractive for investment, like attracting investors like venture capital, or is it more for like product licensing and development?
It's a little bit of everything. So, we look at a project today and we bring it on board and try to help them through the development pathway to a finished product, right? Something, they may have a prototype. we turn it into something that looks like a finished product in a package, sterile product. And all along the way, though, if the company needs money, we're helping them raise that money. We're helping them with their pitch. We're helping them sit at the table across from the investors. And just by having us involved, it instantly reduces the risk from an investor standpoint, knowing that there's somebody that's gone through this before. We've done projects all over the body, so a lot in neurosurgery, cardiology, GI, interventional radiology, gynecology, urology. So what it allows us to do is to sit across from an entrepreneur or a physician and understand their problem pretty quickly. It also allows us to understand what's been done in that space in the past and might be coming, things that we know about. And so that's been a big benefit to our business model. We have about 6,500 square feet of our facility is dedicated to manufacturing. And so all the products we work on from a development standpoint, we want to be the contract manufacturer for those products. And so this is kind of the recurring annuity for us. We are actively trying to grow that part of the business. We ended last year with 2 products that we were manufacturing. We'll end this year with probably 6 that are coming out of the engine that we'll be manufacturing. Everything's pretty low volume right now because they're early stage, but we hope to see that grow the next couple of years. We're ISO 1345 FDA compliant with our quality system. We're also FDA registered since 2007. We've done our own 510K and regulatory filings with those agencies, so we have in-house expertise in doing that. We have an in-house IP counsel that helps us make sure we protect all the development or patents or other novel ideas that we might come up with during the development process. Yeah?
We have another mic here. So I'm just curious, how long does it take for the FDA to usually approve a technology on average? I know every technology is probably different.
Yeah.
And just for curiosity.
It depends on the regulatory pathways. So for a normal 510K application, this is where you're proving you're substantially equivalent to something already on the market. That's generally about 6 months. So from filing, they have to respond within 90 days of your filing, but generally they respond with a bunch of questions that they want more information. Sometimes you can get lucky and you can get through within that first response. And we've had some that were as quick as 90 days, but we've had some that lasted a year.
Okay, that's a lot quicker than I thought. I know there's a difference between FDA approval and FDA cleared.
Yeah.
Can you explain that difference?
Clearance is when you're filing a 510K. 510K, there's 2 main regulatory pathways for devices. They're the 510K, which is you're proving you're substantially equivalent to something on the market. These are generally lower risk devices. There's a PMA, which is a pre-market approval application, and that's where a lot more testing, a lot more data, usually clinical studies are required to go through FDA, and those take a lot longer. Those are multi-year process with FDA. The 510K is on average 6 to 9 months to get through FDA, but again, that's 6 to 9 months after you've done all the development testing and everything else, which is a 2 to 2.5 year process. Yeah.
So when you talk about the difference between approval versus cleared, it looks like you're trying to prove, hey, we do the same job, but we do it better, or what's the target market for you guys? Are you looking to come in and take an idea and improve on it? Or are you looking to come in and create a lower cost option? What's the goal?
Most of the stuff we work on is new technology, and so that's a mix of either creating a new market that doesn't exist, which is what Visualase was. It's much harder to do, but it's much more valuable if you're successful at it, or coming in with what we call a better mousetrap. So there's already an existing market, they're already using some device for this procedure, and you've got a device that's going to do the same thing better. That's a lot easier. We do a lot more of that today because, the regulatory pathways are easier, the commercialization is easier if you can go in and you have a better device that the physician may already be doing the procedure. You don't have to train them on all this. You don't have to, for this one, as you'll learn, this was a lot of heavy lifting, doing something that physicians had never done before, teaching them a technology, a procedure, a workflow, getting hospitals buying something they've never purchased before. So there was a lot of, just varies depending on the technology. Yeah.
So having worked in a physician's office, they have a lot of expensive equipment and things like that, but all of these tests that they do with this equipment, it's already built in that Medicare has coverage for these tests. So for a new device that, like, you want a physician or a hospital to purchase this device,
Mm-hmm.
well, obviously they're not going to be very inclined to buy it unless there's that kind of coverage built in. So how long does it take for those kind of tests or other uses of these devices to get covered by Medicare?
Well, there are different pathways to get reimbursement, but you're right, it's very difficult if it's a new brand new technology, brand new procedure that doesn't fall under existing reimbursement codes. That's a really tough thing, and so it takes a lot of clinical data, a lot of working with insurance companies and Medicare and physicians to support you. It's possible, but it's a long road. What we do today is we look at projects and try to find projects that already have existing reimbursement in place, that you know that you can build a product that has a good margin, that you can sell into that market at a good price, that the physicians can still make money, the hospitals can still make money, the physicians' offices, wherever it is, right? Everybody has to be able to make money, otherwise it doesn't work. It sounds. I mean, there are places where we're developing products to impact patients, but at the same time, if you can't get it to the patient because nobody's financially, everybody's going to lose financially, then it's hard to make work. Anything else? So I'm going to talk about Visualase. This was one of the very first technologies that we worked on. Started as an idea on a napkin in 1999. Eventually grew to a commercial company doing a $4 million quarter on its last quarter, and eventually sold to Medtronic. But I'll tell you the story of how that all happened. This technology was a device for minimally invasive neurosurgery primarily. We were replacing this procedure here, which is a 4 or 5 inch removal of part of the skull. Doctors will do that to dig through normal healthy brain tissue to get to an area that's either causing epilepsy or an area like a brain tumor that needs to be removed surgically. We replaced that with a 3.2 millimeter twist drill hole, just like a normal drill, through the skull. It could be done under even local anesthetics because you don't have any pain receptors in the brain, only on the outside in the skull. And so we would place a fiber optic probe into the same tissue that otherwise would have been resected, and instead we delivered laser energy into that tissue. We used the laser to basically heat the tissue up to cause irreversible thermal damage, and once you heat and necrose that tissue, it's no longer functional. It no longer grows. The body comes in and naturally removes it. You can imagine, you've probably heard of this being done in other areas of the body, liver, kidney, ablation. They do that for tumors. And in there, you can blast away half the liver. It doesn't matter. The patients will do fine. In the brain, you have to know exactly what you're doing at every second you're doing it so that you don't damage a critical structure, you don't treat something you didn't intend to treat. So we also, first lesson, and I'll stop as I go along, tell you a little bit about lessons learned throughout this. As an engineer, you have a tendency to want to use high-tech engineering terms, and so we had to learn pretty quickly that you had to bring this down on a very basic level, especially when talking to investors or physicians that may not be as smart as you, and so you had to make sure that they understood the lingo. So that's something I try to do now routinely today with any product we work on. I want to make sure we understand thermal ablation. So it sounds like you're going in and just vaporizing tissue, and that's not what we're doing. We're talking about treating tissue between 44 and 100 degrees Celsius. Above 60, all cells die instantly. Between 44 and 59, it's time dependent. So it depends on how long those cells are at that temperature as to whether or not they're going to be dead. And so this is a regime in which we were operating. We were raising those cells to this temperature. And we had software which ran on a workstation. This software allowed us to track temperature in the patient. It interfaced with an MRI unit. And it turns out MRI is the only imaging modality from which you can extract temperature information. So our workstation would go grab the MR images, extract that temperature information, and based on the temperature time history would also show a model of cell death. And I'll show you some examples of that. But this workstation it was mostly off the shelf. We had a CPU, we had a laser unit, a pump for cooling fluid. We had a couple of monitors, some software that we wrote. We also had a razor blade, which was the disposable laser applicator. So this was the part that got used once and thrown away. In the beginning days when we commercialized this, we were selling it for about $2,500. At the end, there were places paying $1,800 to $20,000 for a single kit that got used once and thrown away. It had nothing to do with what it cost to make. It had everything to do with the benefit, the reimbursement the hospital was getting. The fact is they were spending $15,000 to $16,000 on devices they were using for that open craniotomy, and we were just replacing that with this tool. So we said, why not command the, and they were getting the exact same reimbursement. So we said, why not replace that with this product, and we charge the same amount for it. Yeah.
So in your company, what is the process of deciding which projects to work on, which projects to not work on? Like, you guys talk to your customers, or you guys determine by yourself that this is the new technology, we should start working on this technology? What is the process? So
today, there's a lot of things that go into the, let's say, the calculus of just saying yes, no to a project. We learned a lot of lessons from this one. Number one, we have to have we don't typically work on research projects anymore. This started out as a research project. It took a long time. We work on development projects. So somebody that already has something that's working, it's already demonstrated feasibility, we take that and turn it into a finished product, and that's more development than research. That's number one. We look for things that in our engine we can bring to market in 2 years or less, with less than $2 million typically. We look for products that already have existing reimbursement, already have, that may have some IP protection, that there's an unmet need in the market, or this device will work better than what's out there in the existing market. And so there's a lot of things that go into that decision tree. And then, obviously, working on something that you have to make it you have to be able to make the product at a price at which you can sell it and have a good gross margin. For a med device, you're looking, you're shooting for margins at 70% plus for them to be attractive to a potential acquirer. So you have to build that into the calculus too early on. I mean, if it's a great technology, but it costs you $1 million to make it, it's going to be very tough.
So is your team also support sustainable projects? Like the products that you already made,
yeah.
Do you provide sustainable services?
Yeah, so for this one particularly, this was developed by Biotex. We spun it out into a separate company that owned the technology, but that company was focused on the sales and marketing. Biotex was the back-end engine. We did all the development work, we did all the R&D, we did all the manufacturing. So that's how we built up this kind of infrastructure and engine that we use today. Yeah.
How did you conduct trials for this, and were there any significant challenges from the FDA side?
Yeah, I'll talk about that as we go along. Maybe we'll get to that in just a second. But yeah, our first studies were done actually in Paris, France. So it was over there we could get medical ethics approval to do the studies. And this was prior to FDA approval. And I'll talk about the regulatory strategy of how we got it through FDA also. IP was important. It is important in this space in the med device world. So, we always, we're very active with any project we work on and trying to protect or put a fence up around it. It's not what I call, it's not what's going to determine your success or not. Execution is going to always determine success. So it's good if you can put a fence up, but I always tell people that, patents, they will provide value. There'll be a checkbox for an acquiring company that's looking at you. But generally, 90% of patents that are out there can be worked around. So it's really about the execution. We did put up some really broad foundational patents on the actual using MR-guided feedback for thermal therapy. We put up some other patents on the disposable laser probe. And these were really these were important at the time the company was acquired. We had 8 issued patents, 6 pending. We had 3 issued outside the U.S. So, as an entrepreneur, you're generally very paranoid. You don't want to tell anybody your idea. You don't want anybody competing with you. Turns out, most of the investors, they're not wanting to steal your idea. They're not going to steal your idea. They won't sign an NDA. So just make sure whatever you're working on, if you think it's proprietary, file the patent and then go talk about it. You don't need to talk about it broadly to the general public. These days, a lot of people will think that putting up their website and talking all about their ideas is beneficial. I tend to stay away from it. I mean, I'll tell investors who I'm trying to raise money from, but putting it out there for everybody else to see and to come up with other ideas that might compete with it, I don't know if that's so beneficial or not. understand the difference between what's in a patent specification and the claim. So the spec is what describes the invention. It will become prior art for anything else that might get filed, and so, but it's not really what's protected in the patent. It's the claims, and the claims are what carve out what area you think you've got protected that nobody else should be able to do. Same likewise when you're looking at other IP that's already out there. Understand that, because if somebody's already got it or somebody's already described it in their specification, it's prior art to whatever you're about to file. Know which countries are important. It used to be we didn't file in China. We just didn't. It wasn't important because they were going to knock it off anyway. These days it is important. They've gotten a lot better with their IP laws, and for med device, they're pretty vigilant. So it's very important to file patents there. Again, most patents can be worked around, so execution. It's still always key with all these projects. I'm going to talk a little bit about the procedure and the workflow and how this was done and how we were, we designed our device to go through existing workflows. So these physicians were already used to putting probes in the brain. They put stereotactic biopsy needles for taking tissue samples of tumors. There was already existing tools for doing that. There's what's called neuronavigation. This is kind of a GPS system for the brain where you take a set of MRI images, you load them into a computer. That computer then sits in the operating room with a camera. The camera then tracks tools that you point at the patient, and so you can determine where the given trajectory might end up. If you start on one area of the skull and you went straight into the skull, you can determine where that trajectory is going. That all allowed us, the physicians that were doing our procedure, to plan probe placement. So no different than planning a biopsy. And so we built tools that worked with the existing instrumentation that they were using, whether it was a head frame or a stereotactic frameless system, and that were compatible with all the major companies out there. We didn't want to reinvent that wheel. The second step, after you've planned your trajectory and you've drilled an access hole, was to place a bolt in the head. This was literally a plastic bolt that got screwed into the head. The sole purpose of that bolt was to maintain the trajectory of the laser probe after you put it into the patient, and also to hold it. There was a little valve that you could tighten around the probe so that probe couldn't move anymore once it was in the patient. And the whole idea there was these patients were often, the probe placement was often done in an operating room. Patients were then often transported to an MRI for the treatment. So between the operating room and the MRI, you had to make sure this thing didn't move. There were places that we did this where the operating room was in the MRI suite. So there's intraoperative MRI. MD Anderson has a nice suite. It's called the brain suite. Literally, those patients are put on a table, and the table swings in and out of an MRI as needed. So when they want to take an image, they can just swing the patient in, take an image, swing it out, continue their operations. Not quite that easy, but it's pretty close. So we also made our software compatible with all the major manufacturers: GE, Siemens, Philips. That was probably 90% plus of the market for MRI software, and so making our software compatible with them allowed us to go into a hospital and integrate very quickly. Installation was really simple. We were on a mobile cart that all we did was plug into a network, and that network would communicate with the same network the scanner was on. And so we could get access to the database where those images were going as they were being acquired. We would just transfer them over to our workstation to do all the image processing. So the first step in the MRI was to find the probe. So you can see the probe here is filled with air initially, which produces a really nice artifact. It lets physicians know that they're in the right spot before they actually turn the laser on. And you'd always confirm that before ever starting the procedure. This is sped up dramatically, but I'll show you some other of these. This is a thermal map here. The software also lets you put little temperature limits on critical structures, and you could say, okay, don't let this go above 45, 50 degrees. And if it did, it would automatically feed back and shut the laser off. So it was an integrated control system for the thermal therapy. This is the damage model. So this takes the temperature time history and it predicts irreversible cell death, and it would just paint it orange. Similarly here, anything that's orange is dead, essentially, not functioning any longer. So physician workflow, we learned a important lesson. We had a competitor that was out there that followed us. They were about 1.5 years behind us. We designed our system to work with their existing workflows. And that gave us a real leg up on that competitor because they designed their own proprietary placement technology. It was not compatible with existing head frames or navigation systems, and so they had a much tougher time getting physicians to just do the procedure. We always try to keep as much of this, I call it known as possible, meaning you're not training them on anything new. These physicians were already trained by many years to put probes in the brain. We just kept it the exact same. There was a couple examples I showed you of some tumor patients. It wasn't until we started working in the tumor world, it was difficult because we were working on patients where we were improving quality of life, we were extending life, we weren't saving lives, we weren't transforming lives necessarily. Most of the patients, by the time they have metastatic cancer of the brain, you're talking a few years of life expectancy. When we started working on patients with epilepsy, it was very different. So epilepsy, these patients live a very long time. And in this particular patient here, this is a patient that has a hypothalamic hamartoma. So a benign mass, it sits right below the hypothalamus, and it causes gelastic seizures. These are laughing seizures. So these kids will often have weird bursts of laughter. People will just think they're odd kids. But really what they're doing is they're having seizures. And every one of those seizures is causing a cognitive deficit. If they continue to have those seizures by the time they're adults, literally they're mentally retarded. And it's all from this little mass here sitting below the hypothalamus. Some of them would have these hundreds of times a day, thousands of times a day. Some of them had them by the time we treated them for the first 6, 7, 10 years of their life. And after the treatment, it was literally like a light switch, turning them off. These patients would go from being, destined to be severely cognitive deficits by the time they're adults to being completely normal kids. And that's when this stuff becomes really addictive, when you get to be involved with technology that has that kind of impact on patients, that has, it was transforming. And not only was the patients appreciative, the families were appreciative, the doctors were appreciative. We had notes from parents that, were almost like some of them write, I'm nervous, I just don't, I feel like this is going to come back. And this is a completely new kid. I've never known this child that is now in our house. So that was really moving. It was moving for me personally. It was moving for our company as a whole. Very motivating to continue the mission that we were on. Another patient here. This is a patient at MD Anderson. This is a tumor right adjacent to the brainstem. Again, you can see how we can treat that area. This is a post-contrast MRI showing what it looks like after the therapy. So that orange model would match up very nicely with this area of damage, and that physicians got a lot of confidence in that over time. They would, once they had confidence in that model, they knew that what they were doing in the patients. This was probably the nicest thing about this procedure was the impact on the patient, right? So this is a single stitch or staple to close the skin. Most of these patients were out of the hospital within 24 hours. Many of the kids didn't even know they had had surgery. They were bouncing off the wall 3 or 4 hours after the procedure. And that's something that even the physicians were shocked by. They had never seen this, right? Most of the craniotomy patients are in a bed for 3 to 5 days recovering. These patients were up and about. We had patients playing golf within 24 hours of having a procedure. This is the third person ever treated with this device in Paris, France. She has multiple probes in her head. She's waiting to go in the MRI. Somebody else was in the MRI at the time, and she asked for a cup of coffee, and they actually gave it to her. So I don't know if that's true, but I like to think it is. I still claim victory there. For the patient stories, you can type in Visualase and epilepsy on YouTube, and you'll find a ton of really awesome stories about the technology. Hospitals would market this. They would literally put this up on their websites. They would do little documentaries of these patients. It was their way to market to other patients that might be thinking about the same treatment or therapy. I always say keep it simple. That's a recurring theme, the product as well. So you want investors, you want physicians or hospitals that might be buying this to know what that product is right away, to be able to explain it very simply. even if you have a platform, which we did, initially we did this in neurosurgery. We were looking at applications in the prostate and liver and kidney and spine, and we were developing tools around all those applications. And that was like the opposite of focus. It wasn't until we started focusing on the neurosurgery, specifically epilepsy patients, that this thing really took off. And so I always, focus is very important. Lock your product down as soon as possible. So from a development standpoint, you can always make something better. And I use this phrase, the enemy of good is better, often. So take the minimum viable product, lock it down, and get it to market as soon as possible, because you can always improve it later. We did a lot of, from the funding side, we did a lot from non-dilutive funding, because that's how we knew how to raise money initially. So we had multiple NIH grants, and that's what also set us on this pathway of pursuing the platform, looking at different applications, prostate, spine, neurosurgery. We had a few grants from Visualase after we spun the company out. And so we were really good at this non-dilutive funding mechanism. It wasn't until we started getting the private investment, though, that things really took a much more focused trajectory on the commercial side. Our first angel investors are in 2005. I put in $400,000. They had a really steep discount on that convertible note. They did really well. They probably did a 13, 14x on their money. Emerging Technology Fund, this was a Texas fund. They put in $750K. At exit, they made about $6.5 million, so they did pretty well on their money. Our Series A investors, we went out for Series A in probably the worst time in the history to go out fundraising. It was the end of 2008, early 2009. We presented to 63 different venture capital groups in person, and we got 2 term sheets, one of which would have killed the company, the other which we accepted. Turned out to be really good. These were very entrepreneur-friendly investors. Those investors took 30% of the company after that Series A. We did a second A2 a couple of years later at a $25 million pre-money valuation. We raised $5.1 million. 3 of that came from a strategic investor, Medtronic. So we had been courting them, dating them for a couple of years, finally got them interested enough to write a check, and so they own 10% of the company at that point. Lessons learned on fundraising. Don't have unrealistic valuations of your technology. That's the biggest mistake that entrepreneurs have early on. There are norms and there are things which investors are going to expect at certain stages of the company, and your goal is to go in and present as best picture and a best scenario as you can. But you don't usually get to determine valuation. They do, until you become like a Google or somebody. So, yeah.
So we had to do, we kind of did a venture capitalist project where we had to we took a current company and had to explain it. And it seemed that a lot of the people in the room were type of angel investors, and they always wanted to see how big you could scale it, it seemed like. So how do you keep that realistic, but also make it, worth millions of dollars or billions for these large companies?
Well, what they're looking at is they want to know that there's a market, right? So that generally, they want to know the market is big enough so that even if you, number one, if there's multiple players in there, you'll be okay. Number two, if you only get a small piece of that pie, it's still a large amount of revenue or profit. And so generally with med device, most sophisticated investors are going to look at and want to see markets that are 200 million to 500 plus. And some won't even touch it unless they see $1 billion market opportunity. Market being defined by the number of procedures available out there times the price at which you plan to sell your device at. Okay, that's how we define market in our world. Yeah. Yeah.
First question is this technology actually a substitute to chemotherapy? And the second question is, like, if it's minimally invasive, so why are you keeping this to just the brain and not to other parts of the body like liver, like gynae?
So the first part is, chemotherapy is generally used more for systemic treatment. So it can be specific to certain areas, but it's generally it's generally used when a solid tumor either can't be removed or can't be treated, right? When you might have some diffuse disease that you're trying to control. It could be used in some areas as a substitute, but that's generally not the area. What it's substituting for is either a surgical resection or another minimally invasive ablative type therapy. Now, there are other areas where this technology can be used. We did use it in liver successfully. We used it in prostate successfully. But the reason we didn't focus there was a commercial reason. So in neurosurgery, the reimbursement was much higher. The unmet need was much higher. Nobody else had a tool or technology to address that need. And in the liver, there was other technologies. There was radiofrequency, there was microwave, there's cryo, there's other things that were being used successfully. The precision and control that we were offering didn't matter as much in liver. Prostate was one where we had phenomenal data. The precision did matter there, but there was no reimbursement. And it was more of a commercial reason. Those patients were controlled by a urologist. And yet this procedure was being done in an MRI, which urologists don't have. So they had to work with a radiologist. And so there's turf wars and things like that that you have to manage too. So commercially, it was a tough place to go after. And that's why we ended up focusing on neurosurgery.
So you keep alluding to the fact that money is kind of the driver here. So do you think, in your personal opinion, that we haven't made as many advancements in cancer research or treatments and stuff like that because you can't make those margins that you can make right now, and that's why you haven't seen those breakthroughs? Or
that's a tough question. I will say that I think there are probably technologies and products which will take a lot longer and may be a lot more challenging to bring to market because of the reimbursement issues. Because if hospitals are not making money, physicians aren't making money, it's tough. It is hard. It's doable, and there are people that can you can go down the route of getting new technologies. There are routes of getting reimbursement, establishing new reimbursement, showing that your procedure is better than others. It just takes more money and more time. And so if you have investors those can be very valuable because then you can, because if you're the only one in that space with a certain technology and you establish that reimbursement, then you've got a real leg up on any competitor, almost like a monopoly on that space for a long time. Yeah.
Going back to whenever you were seeking funding for venture capital, were you noticing as an early growth medical device company, were they demanding a higher rate of return from y'all compared to just other early growth companies? You ever notice that? So I'll say as things start to go better, before we sold this company, we were about to raise money to really expand commercially. At that point, we had figured everything out. We had demonstrated a business model. We had recurring revenues. We had growing revenues, hockey stick-like revenues. We were only in about 35 sites in the U.S. There's 2,000 plus that we could have been in. So we had everything figured out. And at that point, investors were wanting to throw money at us left and right. It's very easy. And so what you're able to command at that point, you're able to drive more and pick the best deal and have some competition to seek the best valuations. We ended up not doing that. We ended up selling the company. But before then, it's very much an investor-driven process where they're dictating terms, they're dictating valuation, and you're deciding whether or not you'll accept it. And so you're still trying to get multiple people at the table, multiple offers, because as you have multiple offers, you have competition, and competition drives better pricing always. But it's just depends on. Sometimes you don't have that luxury. Sometimes you have to take what's available. Yeah.
Talk more about the evaluation of the technology. Is the experience that we have from the product Visualase, the experience can be used in other products of the company, or different products have different hours of evaluation?
Yeah. So the lessons can be used. The valuation may not be the same from this product at a given stage as it will be for some other product. So it does depend somewhat on market size. It depends on how the team will drive a lot of that. So now that we have experience under our belt and we've done this before, we may command a better valuation. We may be able to get a better valuation just because of attracting multiple people that are interested in investing. There are ranges and norms for companies in our space at different stages. And so to get something way outside that is going to be very difficult. I always say, you should have realistic expectations because it is a bit of an art, but it's an art that's kind of bracketed, if you will, with a range. And so you're not going to generally play outside that range unless something extraordinary happens. A couple of other things, we talked about these, but don't start fundraising until you're ready to take the money, meaning you have investment docs that somebody could sign and give you a check and you could deposit it. Make sure you have someone on your team that's done it before. So we got really lucky. We had a guy that was very experienced in this, had worked in the Bay Area for 10 plus years, was living in Houston, had just got done with a gig, was looking for something in Houston, and we were able to recruit him on board at Visualase to be our CEO for that spin-out company. We learned a ton by having somebody that had gone through this multiple times before. I always say that if you've got a full-time job and this is kind of a side gig, you're not planning to give it up, find someone else, because it's not going to be successful generally as a hobby. Yeah.
So for this procedure, you said the first test was done in France?
Yeah.
So how restrictive do you think the FDA is to this kind of innovation? Like how does it impact the startups that want to test new ideas?
Yeah.
But don't have the resources to say, go to France
It's easier to do today than it was when we did this. So it's easier to do studies in the U.S. under FDA regulations, early studies. FDA has not a lot of new programs, early feasibility trials, early studies, pathways that allow you to do this easier in the U.S. It used to be a little bit harder to do and a lot more regulation involved. That's the reason a lot of companies went outside. Looking back on it now, with the amount of resource, time, effort we spent going overseas, we may have been better off staying here and doing the same studies. So, I think it depends very much on the technology and the procedure and what you're trying to develop as to whether or not you need to go seek to do something outside versus inside U.S.
So I'm just curious, do you still do other tests in other countries?
For certain procedures, we might do that still outside U.S. For others, we try to find a pathway here.
Typically, how long does it take to get technology approved?
Yeah, it varies depending on whether you're going through the 510K pathway, which is generally 6 months from submission to approval, or a PMA pathway, which could be multiple years, because generally PMAs are higher risk devices. They require clinical studies generally, and a lot more data is involved. A lot more review time is involved with FDA to approve them.
What's the success rate of ablation? Like once you ablate the cells, like how often they come back?
Well, the area that's ablated doesn't come back. So if you ablate all the cells that are causing a problem, they don't come back. Now, if you leave cancerous cells there, or you leave some there, then that tissue can grow back. But the area which you thermally treat and kill will never come back. It's the same thing when it's gone, essentially. It's gone. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
So I guess this ties into the other markets. Obviously, this company was spun off and then sold. But I guess do you guys work on getting it into other foreign markets? Would that have been part of the next step in the business plan? Or
it would have been downstream, a lot more downstream. We were only, in 35 sites in the U.S. We had a lot more territory to penetrate just here in the U.S. And one of the mistakes that a lot of companies make is going in too many directions, too many geographies, too early. Very expensive to commercialize outside the U.S. And why do it until you need to? Now we would have gone and gotten the regulatory approvals, and we might have tried to find a partner over there. For some technologies, that's the way a lot of these companies do. They'll find a distribution partner. This one would have been hard to distribute because it was a very, we call it a high-touch sales model. You had to be there. We had somebody at every procedure that was ever done in the U.S. from our company was there. And that was important to make sure things went exactly right. Yeah.
So the company has been running from last 21 years, I guess, and it has only 26 R&D engineers, basically. So the number seems pretty low to me. So what's your take on that?
You're talking about Biotech's, our company. So the Biotech's the core company. We spent many years focused on this Visualase spin out, supporting that spin out, not on our current business model. So in the last 2 years, we've gone from a team of about 26 to 25 total employees up to 45. So we're growing dramatically now with our new business model. And it was a choice that we made because we wanted to focus on this one, on making sure we had a couple of success stories coming out of our engine. We spun out another company, which also has, this company grew to have about 35 employees. So, even though we had 20-something at Biotech's, we had 35 in this one. We spun out a second company that also is now close to 20 employees. And so really, the growth on the commercial side came, once the product is developed, it's just supporting and maintaining it, right? And manufacturing it. It didn't require a lot of engineering support, if you will.
Can you kind of give us like an overview or kind of like a timeline of like, so here you are working on your PhD to the point where you have this business and you make your money. Can you tell us like, what did you do along the way?
There was a lot of period of not making money, trust me. But we started the business while I was finishing my PhD. The last year of my PhD, we started the company. It was pretty virtual. We submitted a grant application and got our first project funded. We worked on a lot of projects that were what I call research, high-risk projects. These things, they may or may not make it. There wasn't a clear pathway to a product. It was a research project. And so when you're doing that, then the likelihood of success is maybe smaller, right? But when something hits and you get a good technology like this, the reward can be a lot greater. So we had a lot of those in our portfolio, if you will. Today we focus more on development, like I said. So products that we know we can see a clear pathway to a product that can be commercialized, a product that can be exited, a product that can drive a valuation that is meaning for all involved. Yeah. Back first, yeah.
Just curious, why did you guys decide to sell Visualase rather than continue?
Yeah, that was a good question. So I'll save that. I'll take you through that and I'll answer that question in just a minute, and I'll tell you why.
So my question was more along the lines with the advent of ICD-10 and the relative complexity associated with the actual insurance codes and the reimbursements associated. Have there been more or less opportunities for these medical devices with that clear pathway?
Well, I think, look, as long as reimbursement exists for the procedure in the early, as long as you have codes under which physicians or hospitals can bill for the procedure, then it's not as challenging. And so we seek that out pretty early on, is what's the reimbursement pathway? What are the, and it doesn't have to be that particular procedure. Sometimes the patient that gets into a particular, I'll call it a revenue stream for the hospital, right? The diagnostic workup, the actual procedure, the follow-ups, anything that's surrounding that all makes up a revenue pathway for that particular hospital that patient's going to be going to, or a physician that they're going to be continuing to be seen by. So you just have to look at the whole thing kind of globally to see if there's a pathway. For clinical strategy, we talked about this. So understanding the easiest route is not always going outside the U.S. and certainly not these days. A lot more can be done here in the U.S. For regulatory, we broke this down into 4 different applications, regulatory submissions. We first did one on the laser applicator. We did one on the laser system, on some MRI analysis software, and then we bundled them all together into a submission. And we did that so that FDA could understand them in bite-sized chunks rather than giving them something that they may consider would be a PMA device. We got it through in 510K pathway. So regulatory understanding that is important in the med device space, whether you're a PMA or 510K. If FDA is changing, they're doing interactive reviews, so they're faster approvals now. So it used to be they would get reviews from all their different divisions, and they would send you one big chunk of questions back. Now, as they get feedback from any division, they're forwarding it to you, saying this is coming, get ready for it. And so you can prepare your responses. Lots of consultants out there. Make sure you have one that's experienced in this area or in the area that you're pursuing. We do FOI as Freedom of Information, so you can actually request the actual file from a predicate device that you're planning to compare yourself to. It takes about a year and a half to get that, so you need to look at those predicates and request it as soon as possible. I present this as an idea going into analyzing the market. So a lot of times you'll see entrepreneurs will take a market and say, okay, for let's say brain tumors, I've got 170,000 metastatic, I've got 64,000 primary, so that's my overall, that's my patient market, and they'll throw that in their slide deck and say this market's enormous. Well, we were a lot more sophisticated, and I think it was appreciated by the investors that we were more sophisticated, that we broke this down. We looked at this in detail, and we figured out what were the real number of Visualase candidates out there, and how many probes were we using on average per patient, and what was the ASP at that time on the patients, and that's how we got to a market that was compelling for an investor, because they saw that, hey, they're not just throwing some pie in the sky number out from a market report. They're actually looking at what patients they really can get into this procedure. Same thing in the epilepsy market. We did it wasn't that there's 2.7 million patients in the U.S. that have epilepsy. Well, those aren't all candidates for this treatment, right? And so breaking down those surgical candidates, figuring out which ones really could benefit. Again, it was still an incredibly large market that we were talking about. So I always say, understand your real market. Don't just spit out the numbers from a market report. Focus on U.S. first, but understand the worldwide market. Investors aren't going to worry about their worldwide. They're going to look at, if you're here, they're going to worry about what you're going to do here locally in the U.S. And don't ever make statements like we only have to penetrate 1 to 2% of this market to have a company that's doing X million in revenue. It will instantly show you've never done this before. We talked about reimbursement. It's important on all sides. The hospitals, the physicians, there must be coding out there. And in our case, we got really lucky. Our procedure coded into reimbursement that was, hospitals were on average making between $25,000 and $45,000 for a procedure, which a patient would stay in the hospital for 1 day. And so that was a pretty good business for them. It was good for us because it allowed us to drive our sales price of our disposable applicator up, to have a really nice gross margin on that product. Developing a new market takes time, especially in a discipline like neurosurgery. It was very conservative. We didn't have a lot of data, so it was about finding the right physicians to work with early on, people that were called pioneers because they're willing to take the arrows if something goes wrong. They're willing to take criticism from their peers of doing something that may not have a lot of data behind it. But eventually we did find those right people and grew this nicely. Your question, why we sold when we did. So we had figured everything out. We knew exactly how to scale this. This was easily $1 billion company if we wanted it to be long term. We did so because my co-founder, late co-founder at the time, had passed away in 2012. He had a wife, 3 kids. He was really the brainchild behind this. We knew that selling at this point took care of them for life. We had investors that had been in it for 6+ years, 7 years. It was a really good return for them. And for us, it allowed us now to chalk a win up to go work on a lot of other products, which we were doing today. And so, I think we also figured in the hands of a Medtronic, they have a global distribution network, right? They would be able to get this to more patients faster than we would. Whether that was the case or not, I'm not sure, but yeah, long term it will be, and so those are the reasons we did what we did at the time.
So you presented all your evaluations for your products. Recently, the Trump administration, they are planning to have like some kind of price control. They already removed the safe harbor exemption for medical devices. So rising cost of drugs and medical healthcare in the U.S. and also there's a bipartisan Congress, I say, like going for price control. So how would your company be able to innovate if the current, if this administration gets to impose a price control on healthcare?
Yeah, you know, I have some mixed feelings on some of this. I think there's some things that maybe need to be controlled better because they are maybe, you know, way off on a different scale that make them unaccessible. But we're not, you know, when you price something at a point which doesn't change something that's been done for many years, right? This reimbursement hasn't changed for many years. We're doing it something that's improving cost effectiveness. We're saving money for the patients. We're saving money for the healthcare systems by using technology. Then, you know, I think that it's dangerous to put handcuffs on that too early. Now, I think markets are the best thing to determine price control because, you know, as we had a competitor come out in the market, then you're going to have multiple players in this market eventually. In all markets that are successful, you're going to have multiple players, and those are things that will ultimately, I think, drive price control especially in the med device space. Now, pharma maybe they may have a longer lifespan of drugs and other things, but they have generics eventually. Generics come out, and so there is a limited window for them as well. I don't know. I'm a little bit mixed on it. It will stifle some innovation and some tech development, but in some areas it may be needed. So, anything else? So commercialization. This is lesson number 9. Make sure you get experienced help if you've never done it. My original business plan, I thought we would sell these disposable devices for $600 each. I thought I would make them for $100. Well, it cost us close to $600 to make them, and we ultimately ended up, selling them for $18,000 at some places. And it had nothing to do with it dramatically changed our business model. It changed the value of the company significantly, and it was all because we had experienced commercial medical device sales professionals that were involved with helping us. Don't assume you won't have to commercialize. So we originally thought, well, we'll go do 50 procedures and we'll just sell the company because that'll be enough. We were off by about 800. So we had done 850 procedures by the time we compelled somebody that this market was worth buying. You will have to prove it. If it's a new market like us, this didn't exist. We had to go out and collect the data. We had to go out and work with physicians to assimilate that data to prove to the next guy that it was worth them starting. I call it hand-to-hand combat because literally every day it's one-on-one with one physician at a time, trying to move them to do something, compel them to try this procedure. This is just a summary. Again, at the end, in 2014, you can see the revenue growth. It was nice. That was when we had figured it all out, and it was unfortunate. I call it bittersweet because it was nice to sell the company to Medtronic and have a nice win for everybody, but it was also very tough to let go of at the time when you had worked so hard to figure it all out, and you knew the path forward could be a lot more meaningful. This was the second company we spun out. This was in 2012. This company is now located in Pearland. They're commercializing. It's more of a biotech-related play. So we don't do any more of this type of work. We had a scientist that was working for us that was involved with this company. So after the sale, we had a couple of choices of what we could do. We could have gone back and just worked on our own products again. But we saw a lot going on in the local ecosystem in Houston, the world's largest medical center. Lots of really good ideas coming out of there from physicians. Not many people that have the engine to take it from that idea to a finished product. And so we started offering our services as a development company, but we do it at a lower rate and we take equity in the projects. And so we have a portfolio of companies that we've now taken through that engine. We help them with all the design controls, finalizing the specifications of the products, doing the manufacturing, the regulatory work, putting in the right people in place when they're ready to commercialize. Because at that stage, it's all about execution. It doesn't matter what product you have. You can take a team on the commercial side and they'll sell a C product and they'll be successful. you can have an A product and you put it in the hands of a B team and they can fail. So why the business model? Because for our partners, they get to execute projects right the first time. They can learn from the lessons that we've already learned over many years. They don't have to hire their own in-house development team. That's a very expensive proposition. So we can take projects with a lot more capital efficiency. That's important to investors. It's important to the companies as well as they preserve equity. So to reach the same value inflection points, which are FDA clearances, first-in-man studies, finalized products, we can do that on a lot fewer dollars than otherwise is typically done with a startup. For us, we get to spread our risk across multiple projects. So we have a portfolio just like an investment portfolio. We consider these investments. We vet them just like investments, and so we don't work on just anything. We work on things that we think have commercial potential or potential for manufacturing. I mentioned this, a lot going on in Houston, a lot of different incubators down there. Johnson & Johnson has one, the Texas Medical Center has one. All these are, I call them idea engines because they're usually earlier stage ideas. Usually not always, but usually things that are still looking for funding, are looking for partners to help in the development, and that's where we're getting a lot of our growth today. We're a little bit unique in that ecosystem down there. We're the only company that's actually done this ourselves with our own technologies. We've raised a lot of non-dilutive funding. We've gone through FDA multiple times. We've run clinical studies. We have our own in-house team, so we're not outsourcing the design work. It's all being done under our roof. Regulatory work is being done under our roof. The IP work is being done there. So rather than going out and working with a slew of different consultants or helpers, we do it all internally. This is something I like to end with on these presentations, and it's very much true in this space. In the very early days, it's very tough. We got way more no's than yeses to whether or not a physician would want to try this. And so persistence was important. Finding the right physicians was important. And ultimately convincing groups of the right physicians is important because these guys are very much moved by what their friends are doing or what somebody they trained with is doing, and the data that somebody they respect is putting out. That's really what moves the field in these new markets. But it's funny, yeah. I can tell you multiple stories that went down exactly like this, almost where physicians told you every reason in the world why it wouldn't work, and then there eventually became guys that were standing on the podium telling others why it does. So, this is kind of our current portfolio. We have a number of companies now over the last 4 years that we've incubated, technologies that we helped in the development process that are now commercial that we're manufacturing for. We have another slew that are in this kind of development range that will be manufactured soon. We have others that are kind of still prototype stage that are going through the engine. So just a repeat of earlier, our mission, again, if you focus on products that have a significant impact on human life, I believe that all the rest of the good things will come, and that's what we do. And it's a unique space that we operate in. We think Houston, Texas in general has a significant potential to be a leader in this medtech landscape. It's going to take a long time though because it's any ecosystem takes time, and this one is just really at its earliest stages of developing. So I'll end with that. Thank you.